In this lesson, we are going to complete a practice test for test 4, which is over graphing quadratic equations. Remember, the standard form for these quadratics are ax squared plus bx plus c. A tells you two different things. It lets you know whether it's going to face up or down. If A is negative, it's going to go down like this. And if A is positive, then it's going to go up like that. Okay? It also lets us know whether our graph is going to be wide, narrow, or the same. And by same, we mean the same as the graph f of x equals x squared. So if A is a fraction, then our graph is going to be wide. Okay, kind of like that. Okay. If A is a 1, and it can be a positive or a negative, it'll look something like that. That's around what normal looks like. And then if A is a whole number other than 1, then it's going to be narrow or skinny, like that. Okay? So A right here is a negative 1, because it says negative x squared, and it's understood that there's a 1 in front. So since it's negative, we know it's going to go down. And since it's a 1, if A is 1, positive or negative, then we would say it's the same. Okay? Then they ask us for the vertex. Okay, your vertex is negative b over 2a. That gives you your x coordinate. And your y coordinate is what you get when you plug in negative b over 2a, what you got there, into your x values. So let's put that in simpler terms. So A is negative 1, B is negative 6, and C is negative 5. Okay? So negative b over 2a, and remember, when we plug in a number for a variable, you always surround it with parentheses. So the opposite of negative 6 is 6. 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. And then 6 divided by negative 2 is negative 3. So that's going to give us the x coordinate. Now to find the y coordinate, we take our original equation and we plug negative 3 into our x values. Remember to use those parentheses. If you don't, you're going to get confused with your signs. Okay? So remember, your order of operations tells you have to do the exponents first before you can multiply. So we have to do negative 3 squared, which is positive 9, and then bring the negative down. Negative 6 times negative 3 is a positive 18. Bring down your negative 5. So negative 9 plus 18 is 9. And then 9 minus 5 is 4. So our vertex is a negative 3, positive 4. Okay? And then your y-intercept, if you look at this little thing I wrote up here, your y-intercept is always your c value. Okay, that's the value without any x's next to it. So our y-intercept here is going to be negative 5. Be careful that you notice that it's a negative 5. Okay, so the first thing I recommend you do is graph your vertex. So you start at your origin, and we go negative 3 on the x. So that's 3 to the left. And then you go 4 on your y, so that means 4 up since it's positive. And then we're going to put our dot there. Okay? If you want to label it with a V for vertex, you can. Now, remember, in your vertex you have what's called that axis of symmetry. We talked about that being an imaginary line that goes through. So remember when I said in class about our face, hopefully we all have the same thing on each sides of our face, and that axis of symmetry would actually go through our nose, okay? So that's kind of what that dotted line means. You do not have to draw your dotted line in order to receive full credit. I just think that it makes it easier to see what sides are where, okay? The next thing that you would do is to graph your y-intercept, which would be starting at your origin, and you would go down 5. Let me move so you can't see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Uh-oh, sorry guys. There we go. So again, I started here and I went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's my y-intercept. So remember in class we talked about this dot being our ear and this being our nose. And we want to find where our other ear is. It would be somewhere over here, but we want it to be the same amount of spaces. So let's count. 1, 2, 3 spaces from this ear to your nose. So hopefully it will be 1, 2, 3 spaces from your nose to that ear. Now you can connect your dots. I do realize that I do not have the perfect graph, but what you need to make sure you don't do is this. Okay? That graph means something completely different than if it was rounded out. Okay? If I see that you're doing this, you're not going to get credit for this part of your test, okay? So make sure you are rounding that out, and then remember your graph always ends in these arrows. The last thing you can do before checking or before going to the next problem is you can check your graph. So if you look where it says up or down, notice that our graph is pointing in that downward direction, and where it says the same, normally if it's narrow it's going to be a lot skinnier than this, so that looks just about normal as the graph of x squared. So we can go ahead and move on to number 2. And let's see, so a is a positive 1, so we know our graph is going to point up, and it's going to be the same. Okay, you can look at the chart that I wrote on the first page if you need some direction on that. And our y-intercept is always that last value without an x, so here it would be a -1. Okay, so finding our vertex, identify your A, B, and C. A is 1, B is -4, and C is -1. So we have negative B, so the negative and then this is B, over 2A. So the opposite of -4 is 4 over 2, and then 4 divided by 2 is 2. Okay, so our x value for our vertex is 2. And to find our y value, remember all we do is plug that 2 in place of our x's. So I do that here. So 2 squared is 4. -4 times 2, it's -8. And then bring the -1 down. So 4 minus 8 is -4, minus 1 is -5. So your vertex for this problem is 2, -5. So remember, step 1 in graphing is to draw your vertex or graph your vertex. So start at your origin and you go over 2 and then down 5. Remember, your axis of symmetry goes through here. Remember, you do not have to draw the axis of symmetry, it just makes it easier for you to visualize where your sides are. Next, you graph your y-intercept, which is at -1, so you go to your origin and you would go down 1. And then you count in the direction towards your axis of symmetry. So there's 2 spaces from my y-intercept to my axis of symmetry, so we go 2 more spaces to get to our 3rd point. Now we're going to round it out. And again, notice my graph is not perfect, however, you can get the gist of what I'm trying to draw. Okay? Don't forget to include the arrows at the end of your graph in order to receive credit. Alright, and do your check. Make sure it's facing up. That's the biggest mistake you can make, is you can go the wrong direction and it can face the wrong way. So now let's look at problem number 3. It's going to be facing up because it's a positive A, and it's going to be narrow because it's a whole number other than 1. So now let's find our vertex. A is 3, B is -6, and C is 0. So negative B over 2A. So the opposite of -6 is a +6. 2 times 3 is 6. And 6 divided by 6 is a 1. So that's the value for our x. Then we plug that 1 into all of our x's. Okay, so do your exponents first. So 1 squared is 1. Bring that 3 down. -6 times 1 is -6. 3 times 1 is 3. And then 3 minus 6 is -3. So we're going to then find our y-intercept. Remember, your y-intercept is always that last term and it doesn't have an x. Well, notice that that term isn't written here. Okay, so all you need to do is remember that when it's not written, C is understood to be a 0. So your y-intercept is actually going to intersect at the origin. Okay, so graph your vertex first. So you go to a +1 and a -3. Okay, so draw your axis of symmetry. Then we're going to graph our y-intercept, which is going to be at the origin at 0. Now you count until you get to your axis, and that would be 1 slot. So to find your other point, you would also go 1 slot. You might notice that this one is a little bit harder to graph, especially trying to round it out. Notice that this one is a lot more narrow than this one was, which is what we're supposed to have. It's also facing upward, so we did a good job here. Again, my graphs are not going to be perfect. I don't really expect yours to be either. Okay, so no problem there. If you can't get it completely perfect, just round it out as much as you can. Okay, now let's look at number 4. Okay, so our graph is going to face up because A is positive, and it's going to be the same because it's a 1. To find your vertex, let's identify our A, B, and C. A is 1, B is -2, C is -1. So we get -B over 2A. So the opposite of -2 is 2. And then 2 times 1 is 2. And then 2 divided by 2 is 1. Okay? Then we plug in that value into our original equation in order to get that y value. Oops. So 1 squared is 1. Negative 2 times 1 is negative 2, and then bring that negative 1 down. 1 minus 2 is negative 1. Negative 1 minus 1 is negative 2. I apologize if y'all hear that background noise. My door to my office is open. So there's our vertex. And then our y-intercept is going to be that c value, which is negative 1. Then to graph that, I would graph my vertex at 1, negative 2. And remember, you can draw your axis of symmetry for a visual. Your y-intercept is at negative 1. So you start at your origin, you would go down 1, and we would count. There's one space to our axis of symmetry, so it's one more space to get to our third point. Okay, now we curve it to connect them, and then you draw your arrows at the end. Make sure that your graph is facing upward, and then we're good on problem number 4. Okay, so now let's look at problem number 5. So we know our graph is going to point down because our A is negative, and we know it's going to be the same because this is a 1. So when it's a positive or a negative 1, we're going to say that our graph is the same as that graph of x squared. So now to find our vertex, identify your A, B, and C. A is negative 1, B is a positive 6, C is a negative 5. So we've got negative B over 2A. Okay, so the opposite of 6 is negative 6, and 2 times negative 1 is negative 2, and then negative 6 divided by negative 2 is a positive 3. Okay, so now we find our y value by plugging this answer of 3 into all of our x's. So first off, we've got to do our exponents first. So 3 squared is 9. Bring down your negative. 6 times 3 is 18. Bring down your minus 5. Negative 9 plus 18 is a positive 9. 9 minus 5 is 4. Okay? So now we have our y-intercept, which is negative 5. And we graph our vertex first. So you go over 3 to the right and up 4. So to show you that one more time, you start at your origin and you go 3 to the right and then 4 up. Okay? Remember to draw your axis of symmetry if you start to get a little confused as to which direction to count. And your y-intercept is negative 5. So we're going to start here and we're going to go down 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we count 1, 2, 3 spaces from this point to my axis of symmetry. So I go another 3 spaces to find my third point. And there we go. Okay. And it may be a little difficult for you guys to resist doing this, but try not to do this. A lot of people get a little confused in their rounding and they kind of invert it. So just be careful not to like bring them in at all. Just be a curve out. Okay. Don't forget your arrows. It should face down, which it is, so we are good to go. right, so now let's look at page 6. Or, I'm sorry, number 6. Number 6 is a little bit different, and it really starts to confuse students. Let's first look. It's going to be up, and it's going to be the same because it's a positive 1 for your A. For your vertex, remember that formula is ax squared plus bx plus c. So our A is 1. There is no b because there's no term that has just an x next to it. Okay, so that would be a 0. And then your c is negative 4. So negative b over 2a. The opposite of 0 is just going to give us a 0. 2 times 1 is 2. And then 0 divided by 2 is 0. Remember, whenever you divide a 0 by a number, it's always going to give us an answer of 0. Then, to find your next point, you plug in that 0 in for your x. 0 squared is 0. 0 minus 4 is negative 4. And your y-intercept is negative 4. Okay, so the first thing you should do is graph your vertex. So you go 0 left to right and down 4. Okay, and you can draw your axis if you want to. So then your y-intercept is also negative 4. So that poses a problem for us because now our vertex and our y-intercept are the same point, so there's nowhere to count. So we have to use a different method for graphing. So we have this x squared minus 4. What we can do is factor it, set it equal to 0, and solve. And if you remember, we learned how to do this in the first couple of problems in section 8.1. So if you do want to visit that video for a little bit of a review, you can, but that's where we learned this. So x plus 2 equal to 0, x minus 2 equal to 0. So you should get answers of positive 2 and negative 2. So remember, these are your x-intercepts, meaning where your graph crosses the x-axis. So we go to a negative 2, and we go to a positive 2. And notice how that still is going to give us a very rounded graph. It should be pointing up. There you go. And just so you know, by factoring, you should also get the same exact results. If you wanted to solve these problems more by factoring than using the counting method, then you absolutely can. So let's look at problem number 7, which is the last problem of this review. So our graph is going to be facing down, and it's going to be narrow, because it's a whole number other than 1. To find our vertex, A is negative 2, B is 8, and C is 0. So negative B over 2A, so we get negative 8 divided by negative 4, which is positive 2. And then, to get our y value, we plug that answer of 2 in for our x values and solve. Do your exponents first. So you bring down that negative 2. 2 squared is 4. 8 times 2 is 16. Negative 2 times 4 is negative 8. And then negative 8 plus 16 is positive 8. Our y-intercept, notice there is not a value without an x, so that means our y-intercept is 0. So first thing you should do is graph your vertex. So you go over 2 and up 8. Okay. Then you graph your y-intercept, which is at this 0. And you can draw your axis of symmetry through your vertex. I forgot to do that at first. And then you count. 2 spaces this way, 2 spaces this way. Alright. Notice your graph is facing down, and it's a little more narrow than what we're used to in these other graphs. So you should be good to go on that one. As a reminder, don't forget when you're drawing your graphs, you need to have them more rounded. You need to have your arrows at the ends of your graph. And then, I didn't mention this before, but make sure you include these parentheses here for your vertex. Your vertex is a point, so a point is always going to have parentheses surrounding it. If you do not include those parentheses, you're not going to receive credit. You need to start paying a little bit more of attention to detail, so make sure that you don't forget that. I wish you the best of luck.